everyone, and welcome. I'm just going to wait a little bit here, just at a slight lag time, because we know people were just ending a session. They're coming in, trickling in through the waiting room. It looks like we're getting up to numbers, so I'll start pretty soon because we have a lot to cover here. And we will do our best to cover as many things and as many important things on this issue as we can. Today, I'm going to be talking with these fine gentlemen about China and disengagement, as you probably saw on the agenda. This is, I think, an issue that's not covered very well. It's often covered in a very binary kind of understanding in just all across kind of global media, but also in policy. People tend to kind of make that mistake. And so I think we're going to try to clear up some of the nuance in this issue. I'm joined today by Robert Atkinson, president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, and Washington Post opinion contributor and CNN analyst Josh Rogin. Both of these gentlemen, we're very honored to have you, by the way, so thank you and welcome. Both of these gentlemen have worked for a long time, as have we at Invent IP, on a number of different issues related to the kind of PRC activities that we would consider malign. So from multiple angles, I think our careers have interwoven. I certainly have gotten a lot of inspiration from the work that both of you have done. Rob, I think early on when I was writing Theft Nation, I started reading some of the pieces that you were putting out at ITIF, and they struck me as something that was both brave. People weren't saying those kinds of things. You wrote a piece called "Enough is Enough" that we were just talking about in the green room, that I found to be refreshing, because at that point, 8 years ago or 10 years ago, there was not a lot of talk about the kind of economic malign activities of the PRC. Can you tell us a little bit more about the kind of early foundational pieces that fit into that puzzle for you? What did you start to see on an economic level, on a tech and innovation level, that was worrying you?
Yeah, so I wrote a piece, or ITIF, we wrote a piece I think in 2011 called "Enough is Enough: Confronting Chinese Innovation Mercantilism." And that was actually stimulated because by then, I think I had been on this Obama White House. I was chairing this U.S. innovation and U.S. China innovation experts group, I think by then, for about 2 years. So would go over to China, their counterparts would come over here. And I got to really talk to a lot of Chinese officials, NDRC and MIT and others, and really dug into what they were doing. And, I was outraged. You just go down the list, and we had a whole typology of their bad practices, whether it starts with IP theft, massive forced tech transfer, massive subsidies, standards manipulation, unfair government procurement, unfair antitrust enforcement. I mean, you just go down the list. It's clear what they're doing, which is using any means possible to first of all, gain the recipes they need to build up technology industries by unfair means, including cyber theft, then close their markets to foreigners, massively subsidize their buildup, and then the third stage is what they call going out. And I would term it industrial destructionism. I mean, it's designed to go and seek and destroy. And we saw that with telecom equipment. That's what they're doing there. And we saw it with high-speed rail, solar panels, where the US at one point had 55% of the market. Now we were down to 5%. The Chinese are up to 65%. So I'm not saying they're omnipotent. I'm not saying they're efficient. They're neither of those, but they certainly are predatory.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we put into Theft Nation was we were trying to distill that concept, and they have a lot of different ways that they describe these processes. Some of them are quite entertaining. I mean, when they're talking about IP theft, they often use kind of biological terms, I noticed, in their internal documentation. So it was like redigestion of foreign IP was one that always caught my eye. But we tried to boil it down to 3 concepts, which is steal, amplify, dominate. And that's kind of what you were just talking about. So you take the industry through whatever means necessary. Sometimes it's legal, sometimes it's a purchase, but more often it's identifying an industry that's key tech, and then just cyber theft, espionage, you name it. There have been a number of really, really wild cases of espionage in the tech industry. Do you think that there are any major themes that, as we kind of set up the foundation here, that people should understand about what they're taking, why they're taking it?
Yeah, I mean, I know you should never use Hitler analogies, but if you read Mein Kampf, it was pretty clear what Hitler was going to do. He said it. If you read their documents, it's very clear what they want. They want, I can't remember the numbers, but 75% domestic semiconductor autonomy. So it's very clear they want to be leading in biotech and genomics. They want a leading domestic aerospace industry to compete with Boeing and Airbus. So why are they focusing on these sectors? They're focusing on basically what I would term strategic industries. So dual use industries, that's really what they want to do, that are technologically complex, that can drive their economy, gain them global power, and at the same time support their military. One last thing I'll just say is I think it's really important, in my opinion, to understand where we are with China, and that's we're no longer, in my opinion, able to change their behavior. We lost that opportunity. I mean, Trump tried, failed. I think we had that window was maybe starting to close at the end of the 2000s, but it's closed now. So I don't think we can change what they're doing. I think what we need to be doing otherwise is to slow them down and make it harder for them to succeed. But I don't believe we're going to change them until Xi Jinping is out of office and maybe there's a reformer.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point. It's a good segue to you, Josh, too. And by the way, I just want to add a note. This comes up a lot on China issues, but when we say they and China, we're talking about the government. We're talking about the PRC government. We're talking about the Chinese Communist Party. That should be obvious, but it's a regular point of propaganda to take anyone who says anything bad about China and make it sound like they're, talking about the people of China. Where I think in this conversation particularly, perhaps maybe more long-term than short-term, but the people of China would also benefit from the kinds of things we're going to be talking about. The people of the world would benefit because these things are global issues. So Josh, I think that's an excellent segue into some of the stuff you've done. The rise of Xi Jinping has been, kind of a sight to behold, to be honest. There's been, disappearances of lots of different other poles of power in China. People have been, disappeared physically. Xi has taken quite a strong control of the government compared to what existed before him. It's been, a powerful rise. People compare it to Mao. And you covered, in your book, Chaos Under Heaven, you covered a lot about kind of the new the new dynamic between the U.S. and China, between what was going on in the Trump administration in China. Can you talk a little bit about, in the same way that Rob did, about what your journey was, kind of learning what the PRC really is attempting to do here?
Sure. Thanks, Evan. First of all, I'd just like to say how thrilled I am to be back at FIRE 2022. It's always a great conference. It's always a great community. As you guys know, the Andersons have been all over this case for a lot longer than any of us. I remember first meeting you, Evan, in Aspen at another conference we won't mention. You have been teaching me about this issue ever since. And for those of you who don't know, the Andersons are a great resource for journalists, including me, and have really made a difference in this space. So anytime the Andersons call, I pick up the phone, and I hope to. My only regret is that we can't all meet in person. Maybe FIRE 2023, we can all see each other face to face. As you very nicely mentioned, and it's a pleasure to be on this panel with Rob too, because people like him have been waging this fight often in the margins or in the darkness, and now that everyone's joining in, they have a lot to teach us about how this fight has been going for the last 20 years. Now that everyone else seems to suddenly, for some reason, realize it's worth fighting, and we can talk about that too. But what I sort of traced in my book Chaos Under Heaven, paperback coming out next week with an exclusive interview with President Trump, some news breaking information on Taiwan, is sort of the slow awakening of Washington and then American society in various sectors to the growing and advancing strategy of the CCP, especially since Xi Jinping came to power at late 2012, and how basically each of our governments has fumbled that response in its own way ever since. And there was a case to be made in 2012 that not a case that Rob agreed with or that you agree with, Evan, or me, frankly, but a case to be made anyway, that Xi Jinping might not take China on what we're now seeing, which is the Great Leap Backward, which is the literal erasing of Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening up, for all intents and purposes, from Chinese history, and a revisionist rewriting of Chinese history in their own information space, and then a expansionist, aggressive interference and influence campaign aimed at us. And those two things are deeply related, of course. And they meet us in our free and open societies in a number of ways. And the biggest way that we're not paying attention to is through what's called the United Front. And this is the Chinese Communist Party's well-funded, well-established influence network. It exists through hundreds and thousands of proxies, billionaires and institutions pumping money and disinformation and economic aggression and influence into all of our institutions, academic institutions, tech institutions, political institutions, Hollywood, sports, you name it. Okay. And it's so it lives in that space somewhere between straight up propaganda and secret spying. It's advancing a Chinese Communist Party agenda without stating as such, by laundering the money and then laundering the messages through Americans, through American voices. And they do that by seeding relationships over time. And it's quite different from what we see, let's say, from the Russian influence, which is very sort of military or organized and clanky. And, we see the Facebook pages and all this. This is through the seeding of our institutions to disable the antibodies in a healthy democracy. And it's tough to talk about because it's designed to be tough to talk about. So that's a broad introduction into, sort of how I think about CCP influence on our shores, forget about around the world. And then when it comes to Xi Jinping, first, of course, the Obama administration signed a bunch of deals with him, cyber deals, and Xi Jinping made a lot of promises about not to militarize the South China Sea. It was all lies, all now proven demonstrable lies. And, then the Trump administration, and this is a complicated story that we can't get into right now, tried to change the narrative. They flipped over the chessboard, right? But because the Trump administration was dysfunctional, they had trouble sending it back up again. And just to skip ahead to how this impacts the conversation that we're having today, in the tech sector, they did a number of things. There was a number of efforts. There were sanctions, there were tariffs, there were entity lists in the Commerce Department, there were Treasury OFAC lists, there was a CFIUS reform effort. These were all efforts to get at this problem of China's economic aggression, which had never really been government policy in the first place ever before. And these efforts often weren't lashed up with each other. And some of them failed and some of them succeeded. And you'll have to buy the book to get the details on that. But the bottom line is that all of a sudden we realized that the struggle against Chinese Communist Party aggression was not really solely about islands and ships and missiles. It's about our critical industries of the future, and we have to protect them and protect the world from the Chinese versions of them. And all of a sudden that's become something that we can sort of agree on, although there's certainly no agreement on how to get there. Now, I'll just, before I hand back the microphone, I just say that what I think is often missing from this conversation is the real latest bleeding edge of the effort of the Chinese Communist Party to transfer wealth and power and influence from us to them, and that's in the capital markets. Okay, and there's an entire Zoom to be done on how, while the government is trying to sanction, tariff, restrict, slow down, speed up, manage exports and imports and investments and this and that, Wall Street is undermining all of those efforts wantonly and egregiously, hand over fist for decades, and making profits on both sides. And this is done through a number of corrupt and some legal and some illegal, but all nefarious schemes. And one of the, through reverse mergers and stock market listings based on fraudulent documents. And, it's just a horrendous hole in our security, prosperity, freedom, and our public health that the Wall Street firms are pouring, are making bigger every day, quite the opposite of the rest of society, which is sort of mobilizing now to deal with the threat. And we can get into that if you want to, but the bottom line is that what they're doing is they're creating a situation such that our institutional investments, and that means our pensions, our troops' pensions, our university funds, our state pension funds, are all being invested in Chinese companies that build concentration camps, Chinese companies that build the cameras atop the concentration camp walls, Chinese companies that build the missiles that are pointed at us in the islands that they're situated on, and the Chinese companies that are hacking us, and all the rest. So that's I'm going to stop here because I'm talking too much. But the bottom line is that when we talk about protecting our society, especially our economy, from the Chinese Communist Party strategy, we're only as strong as our weakest link, and our weakest link right now is Wall Street. I'll stop there.
Yeah,
Hey, Evan, could I just a quick follow-up
I say
to that?
sorry, one more thing, and then I promise.
Yep.
You said after Xi Jinping comes out of office, we'll see a change, because I totally
I said we
agree
might.
We might.
I said that's the only way we'll see it change.
Right.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to note that it could be a reformer, but likely it might be somebody worse, because
Oh, I don't disagree with that. I'm just saying under Xi Jinping,
so
we're
be
not
careful
gonna
what
see
you
it.
wish for.
Yeah.
So we
No, I'm not wishing for anything. But just a quick point. I did some research on this a while back. The Maryland, where I live in Maryland, the Maryland State Pension Fund invests in Chinese-backed venture funds that are investing in companies that are challenging the U.S. State of Maryland is doing that.
Right.
This is outrageous to me that the governor
Completely.
is allowing that, and there's probably more states that are doing that.
Yeah, and universities. There's now a divestment. We call it the Uyghur Genocide Divestment Movement, and it started at Catholic University, and where students compel their trustees to scour their endowments for things that are related to the Uyghur genocide and other human rights abuse. It's just getting started, right? This is how sort of apartheid was defunded in the 60s and 70s. It started with 172 universities. Okay, but that's a project for a long-term strategy. What's going on right now is that these Wall Street firms are actually drastically increased, mostly through the index funds, MSCI, FTSE Russell. That's why all the state pension funds are investing. They're following the index funds. The index funds passively track $14 trillion of investments. It blows out stocks and bonds and IPOs by like a factor of 100. So the index funds are increasing their holdings of these problematic Chinese companies, so that all of the state pension funds will follow suit. And so what's the point of sanctioning Hikvision for making the cameras that spot Uyghurs? You know, they have the AI where they can pick the Uyghur out of the crowd so the policeman can come down and tell you what's what. We're sanctioning them, but then the indexes are directing 10 times the amount of money back right into them. It's
so Jack,
crazy.
I'm going to stop you for a moment because there's a ton to cover. And I appreciate everything you're saying. It's all true. All really
you got to stop me or I'll go forever.
Yeah. And I know that, and that's okay. So we just covered a lot of territory very quickly in classic Josh Rogan style, which is great, but I want to touch on some of these issues. To take it back to an earlier point that you made, Rob, you were talking about the fact that telecom equipment was a good example of a process where there had been theft. We were talking about steal, amplify, dominate. Josh is kind of touching on exactly the same concept with the financial problem. So I want this to be about solutions, right? I want this panel to get into the solutions. The problems are myriad. What do you see, Rob, as a way to deal with this kind of issue? Like, is there an easy way for us to envision a future where we aren't investing in these companies that have, stolen IP? We aren't investing in these companies that are perpetrating genocide. And what would it look like?
Well, first of all, look, we're all against genocide, but I don't think that can or should be the dominant thing. What we're against with China is their complete manipulation of the global trading system using predatory policies to destroy jobs and technologies in the Western world. That's the issue. So they could stop their genocide, and are we still going to allow them to do all this other stuff? I would say hopefully not. I think there's three main things we have to do. The Chinese strategy is basically to gain enough knowledge to make the recipe, if you will. In a lot of these technologies, you might be able to get the recipe book, but unless you have the tacit knowledge to make the recipe, you can't build these technology industries. We need to really ratchet that down. That means cyber theft. It means beefing up FBI commercial counterintelligence efforts. It means considering passing what Cornyn wants to do, Senator Cornyn, which is to make foreign U.S. investments in there subject to CFIUS. Why is tech transfer to China not subject to CFIUS, but they're investing in and buying a firm here? We need to cut off their ability to invest in venture capital in the U.S. A few years ago, they were putting about $3 billion a year into biotech. That's how they're getting that knowledge. So cut off the knowledge, or I should say you can't cut off the knowledge flows, but dramatically limit the knowledge flows. That's number one. Number two, Senator Cotton had a really interesting report on China recently, and he said what we're been talking about, at least at ITIF. The next step, I think, is we need to identify industry firms and products that are based upon stolen IP and massive subsidization, and just say, no, you are never going to export those products to the US. because they're based on stolen IP or massive subsidization. So I would never, ever in a million years allow the Chinese to sell a COMAC plane to the US. Maybe they'll never get to the point where they get FAA certified, who knows? But COMAC it's not a legitimate company. It's not a legitimate company. It was based upon coerced tech transfer and massive subsidies. So ideally, we'd get our allies to join with us on that. But I think those are the two main things. Then I would agree with Josh, if we can cut off or limit capital flows, I think that'd be a good thing. But I don't think that's the key. They have a lot of capital. I think the key is the recipes and then take away their market access in those situations.
Yeah, and I think that kind of segues nicely too. So we had a few years ago, I'm trying to remember which year, but we had Dan McGann come. He was from an American wind turbine company, and he made the point that in his own hometown, after he was ripped off by a company that was supported by government policies in the PRC, his own hometown in Massachusetts had bought one of the ripped off wind turbines and installed it right next to his company, right? So just down the road. And I think that speaks to your point, Rob, which is there's absolutely no reason, and we've been pushing, I've written about this in Disengagement, there's absolutely no reason that we should let them rob us on both sides. You know, the idea that you would both be robbed of your IP and then resold that self-same IP just really cripples companies, and those companies kind of make up the lifeblood of our economy. If you let that go, that is the definition of economic warfare, right? If you let that go, your tax revenue goes down. If your tax revenue goes down, everything else starts to decrease, you know, any sort of public spending. So it's a very parasitic relationship. And in that way, I think the policies that you're describing, some of the policies that I've described in Disengagement make not only sense, but are almost effectively mandatory. I don't think you can have that kind of relationship go on for long before you start to lose serious quantities of your tax base, you know, the jobs that kind of keep the economy rolling the way it should in America. And this also, by the way, applies all across Europe. I want to get, we've got major categories to cover, and I want to get a little bit into the idea of the United Front, because I posted—
You want to hear my solutions?
Yeah, what do you got?
You asked for solutions. Those were, you gave us like 10, 20 good solutions. I got a couple solutions, because I think just let's start with the Wall Street stuff, since that you brought that up. You know, here's my number one solution for turning off the spigot of Americans investing in companies committing genocide and building the machine that's going to attack us. Enforce the law. Enforce the law. You know, we have something called the SEC, and it's not doing its job because it's allowing hundreds of Chinese companies to operate on our markets without adhering to the very basic fundamental standards of disclosure and financial transparency, because they can't, because their government won't let them, because the party is taking control of their corporations beyond any doubt, beyond any dispute. So why is that? Why isn't, we actually have a law that says Chinese companies that don't comply have to delist within 3 years. Well, it's been about a year and a half, 2 years. How's that going? You'll find that it's not going well. When it comes to sort of, I think the technology piece, I think, what we have to do is we have to up the tariffs and the sanctions, because the Trump administration, a lot of people thought the tariffs were about pressuring China to play ball in the trade deal. And maybe that's what Trump thought, actually, but they weren't. The people who actually designed them, and Rob, you know this well, designed them to try to throw sand into the Chinese economic machine, especially on the technology level, to grind them into the middle income trap, right? To make sure that they don't leapfrog us on technology before their people start demanding more money and crap, such that they can't pay them nothing anymore. And if the Chinese economy were to fall into the income trap, that would be nice. But anyway, we can't do that with sanctions that are a year and a half old. Sanctions and tariffs wither over time. The markets adjust, the countries adjust, they find ways around them. So when are we going to see a real trade policy from this administration? It's been a year. When are we going to see a affirmative Indo-Pacific economic and offering to counter Chinese One Belt One Road? When are we going to see something more than just blue dots and clean? Now, you know what I mean? There has to be real investment. Why aren't our country's economic tools being turned on, like the DFC, just for one example, to compete with China in the third world. So we can't fight something with nothing. And the last point, I promise, is the last point. We need to apply a national security lens to scientific collaboration with China on all fronts. And I'm not just talking about dangerous coronaviruses, but for example, dangerous coronaviruses, because what we've discovered over the last 2 years is that the Chinese scientists, nice people as they may be, are not allowed to do open science. They're not. They're controlled by the party. The science is all being shoveled out the back door to the military, who will certainly abuse it and build things that will scare us. Okay. So we need to totally not completely decouple, not completely disengage, but to find out where the new lines are in recognition of the way that the relationship has changed.
Yeah, I really agree with that. And I think that's kind of part of what I had in mind when I wanted us to get together today, is that the concept of decoupling is a bit silly, the way it's described often, because there are a number of these platforms, I mean, we've just covered a huge number of them, but there are a number of these platforms on which we should not be engaging in the way that we are, right? So when we play into the hand of the CCP, the problem there is that they've set up these systems on purpose. They have a goal. We're kind of sailing along here as the U.S. thinking that there's no issue, but now there's been a sea change, I think, in public opinion about that, which is great. But it's critical to kind of find the middle ground where you're not playing into these systems that have been set up to be predatory, to move American capital into companies that are going to help commit genocide, et cetera. I think that there's a lot of interesting comments coming in the chat too, but I think that it would be good to touch on United Front. So I don't think a lot of people know what that really means. I dropped in a little bit of an article into the chat for anybody who's curious. Rob, you had mentioned the need for better counter espionage efforts at FBI. I think that that's always been a problem for the kind of the whole beginning of our century. We've had, efforts, but not enough efforts on that front. Mark mentioned in the chat, Confucius Institutes, which are now starting to be shut down. Just as a quick preamble, United Front is a very large and expansive program of influence campaigns and essentially espionage that the PRC government has funded all around the world. So those Confucius Institutes are, portrayed as cultural institutes. They're actually kind of an espionage machine. They're well funded by the party. They are regularly used in all sorts of different ways we wouldn't like, much like consulates and embassies can be centers of espionage, but these are, in our universities. So what a big problem being dealt with. Josh, go ahead. Let's talk a little bit about other ways that United Front is kind of creeping out through the world, what its objectives are, and ways that we can counter it, ways that we can disengage with that system.
Right. It's really important, actually. Excuse me. The United Front, it was created by Mao, and it's still described in CCP internal literature in Maoist terms, quote, to strike the party's enemies using the party's friends. And what it is, excuse me, it's the bureaucracy that organizes the party's interactions with anyone who's not in the party. So that means Chinese people who are not in the party, like Chinese institutions who are not in the party. It means overseas Chinese, and it means foreigners like us. So when the United Front takes over the Uyghur issue, they are actually structurally and bureaucratically overseeing not only the repression of the Uyghurs, but also the propaganda campaign, and also the effort to fight the narrative inside of our own society. So that's what they do. Okay, now that's there's something called United Front work, which could be performed by almost any Chinese government entity that contributes to this overall cause of harmonizing people who are not in the party with what the party wants and needs and demands. Now, inside of our own society, one example is academia. I joined the Confucius Institute at my alma mater, the George Washington University, which is about 5 minutes down the street this way from my basement. And I wanted to see what was the United Front influence at the Confucius Institute. And as it turns out, at the GW Confucius Institute, there wasn't really any nefarious, at least that I could tell. So it's not clear cut. It's not always the same. Now, of course, at GW, you don't need a Confucius Institute to do your spying and influence, because it's Washington. There's spies everywhere, right? There's influence agents everywhere. But just for one example, in the University of West Florida, which is a real example, the FBI found that the Confucius Institute had a bunch of Chinese spies in it, because that's a perfect place to hide it there, right? And another place is the the United Front works with student associations. This did happen at GW. That the Chinese Student and Scholars Association protested the protests of the genocide during the Olympics. In other words, there were protest posters protesting the genocide. Here comes the Chinese Student and Scholars Association calling the anti-genocide protests racist and anti-Chinese and anti-Asian. So they wage abuse the social justice narrative to defend CCP atrocities. But that the United Front also has the Florida Organization for the Unification of Taiwan, which gives money to politicians. They have the UN Organization for the Common Destiny of Mankind, which will try to throw money at businessmen and UN diplomats and whoever will take the bribe. And then there's the high level part of it, which are foundations like the Chinese US Exchange Foundation, which funds, for example, the Jimmy Carter Center Foundation, the George H.W. Bush China Foundation, the Brookings Institution, the SAIS at Johns Hopkins, the Carnegie Endowment, so their money is everywhere. This is a United Front organization that's run by Teng Chee-hwa, who is the former Hong Kong executive after the handover. And they take hundreds of congressional staffers on full paid trips to China every year, not this year, but every year until the pandemic. 7-star tour, welcome to Xinjiang. Oh, come meet these Uyghurs. They're so happy. Look, they're doing a good little dance in their costume. So don't let anybody tell you there's a genocide going on. And they've been doing this for decades. Okay. So that's billionaire money. And that billionaire money goes into schools. It goes into sports. It goes into Hollywood to protect the party from anything and to advance its interests without stating as much. That's really the nefarious part of it.
So Rob, you were talking too about the Bureau, and maybe you can kind of walk people a little bit more through sort of the way that plays out when there's, more corporate espionage going on. We've kind of talked a lot about the stuff that goes on in more political bodies. So.
Yeah, I would also just quickly second what Josh said. The last couple of years, I've really dug into this question of who lost China, but way back in the 49. But what's really interesting back then is the influence of the United Front then, and people like Owen Lattimore, who was a communist, people in the State Department. I don't say that in a paranoid sense. Pacific Affairs was their journal that was very influential in shaping U.S. foreign policy towards China, and it was paid for in part by Mao. We still see that today, as you said. The other one thing I do want to mention, really important, and I'm just shocked that it keeps going on. There was an American scholar who was a China hand, and he wrote something against China, and so he was denied a visa, and nobody said anything. I said something. I said, all China scholars should boycott China. Just don't go anymore.
We've talked about that a lot.
You cannot allow that kind of intimidation. And of course, the scholars didn't want to do that because they'd have to give up their thing about going to China and getting a good story. But that goes back to this Chinese monopsony issue. I mean, that's the core of all of this. It's monopsony. They have so much power, and they're able to pick off individual companies, individual scholars, individual universities. When it comes to the FBI, it was funny, right after I wrote that early report, I had a visit from the FBI just because hey, this is interesting. And so I talked to some of the folks, and a couple of folks there ended up writing a couple of pieces for us, which are on our website about and they were in commercial counterintelligence and FBI. I was surprised they were allowed actually to write critical pieces. One of the guys now is at George Washington, I believe. But it was basically that, that they're just not staffed. Now, under Trump, it may be different. I think Trump did staff that up more, but they really don't have, at least at the time, they didn't have the resources they need. There's all these vectors that the Chinese are really good at getting into companies. And, if you're a mid-sized company, say $500 million, you may not know what those vectors are. And you really need people like the FBI commercial counterintelligence people to help you to figure that out, to start sharing that intelligence around as a much more robust network. And, I think we're doing more there, but I don't think we're doing anywhere near enough.
Yeah, that actually reminds me, Rob, I had a meeting, it was not with the US government, so I'm allowed to say this, but I won't specify with whom, and there's obvious reasons for that. But I had a meeting some years ago with some folks that were tracking some of those kind of corporate espionage attempts. And they showed me an entire network that had been built through all the job posting websites, right? And so we were kind of like, you know, in their little basement lab, and we're looking at all these different kind of like nodes of different people that had been inserted into companies using all these different job postings. And so it became quite clear that the kind of social networks of business had been very well infiltrated. And it makes sense because it's smart, right? We're dealing with guys that are dedicating all their guys and gals that are dedicating all their time and energy to figuring out how to do this well and discreetly. And so it's a big issue to tackle. Also, one more anecdote. I was speaking at a conference some years ago, and there was a representative of the bureau there, and I'm not sure what the reason for his perspective was, but at the time, I think FBI was stating publicly that they estimated, it was quite some time ago, that they estimated 25,000 people were probably inserted into American companies that were actually working for the Ministry of State Security, either indirectly or directly. And I went after him when he, mentioned that stat, and I said, I think it's a lot more from everything I've seen. And within, 3 months, they had doubled it. And so I think that the degree of the issue, we can spend all day arguing about the numbers, but the degree of the issue is high. It's, there's a lot of it happening. And therefore we need to enable our counter-espionage folks to do that. That's one thing that we've focused a lot on at Invent IP, is that we do want those public-private partnerships to occur. We do want companies to be able to talk to the US government, get help from the US government on these issues. Have you seen progress on that front, Rob, over the past decade?
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems with 9/11, that whole side of things just went way down as the FBI focused on counterterrorism. And then it started to build up a little bit. So again, I haven't looked at it in the last couple of years. So I do believe there's been progress. But one of the challenges, though, is that the criminal penalties are quite low. There was a recent case, Josh, you may know about it, and I don't remember the case, but I remember the person was a Chinese spy, was prosecuted and convicted, and a 3-year jail term. Are you kidding? How about a 15-year jail term? I mean, 3 years is nothing. These are serious crimes that have serious effects on our economic and national security, not to mention the economic well-being of these companies. My favorite story was in the case of Nortel, which the Chinese helped destroy. When Nortel went out of business, they had found out that the Chinese had been in their computer system from 1999 to 2008 when they went out of business. They went out of business, and so the Canadian Defense Department actually took over their building. They needed space. And as they went through it, wand it and all that, so they ended up finding microphones just all over the place, hidden in walls, just rampant. You got to wonder how many companies in the US have that right now.
Yeah. And I think that's one thing, speaking of, solutions and the solution side of this conversation, that's one thing that really could improve in the US is companies having their own security posture that's just a lot stronger. And we've worked on that too. I think we've all written about that. It's kind of just part and parcel to the modern world, with the PRC still, having these objectives and Made in China 2025 going on. You need to be able to wand your entire building, and you need to be able to, bring in a team that understands that kind of stuff. There's a comment in the chat about the Waldorf Astoria, where we used to hold meetings being bought up by a Chinese government entity. So we stopped holding meetings there, but and so did the US government. Josh, I see you raising your finger. I also want to touch on, because we're getting close to time for Q&A here. We've got about 7 minutes. I also want to touch on the pandemic and other international bodies like the WHO. I think it kind of relates to the general human health aspects. So if you want to talk about whether it's genocide, whether it's, machinations within the WHO that prevent us from dealing with the pandemic, and whether it's the environmental issues that come from, coal and stuff. There's, I think, a great threat posed to human health by the way that the CCP and the PRC government operates now. Do you have any thoughts, Josh?
I have many. Where to begin? Well, first of all, on your point about the Waldorf Astoria, that's where the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations lived and worked until the Chinese bought it up, and then they moved. But famously, Jared Kushner held a meeting there with the head of Ong Bong Insurance and tried to get him to bail him out of 666 Fifth Avenue, and the whole thing was instantly leaked. And so apparently it's still bugged, because they had the leaks were so detailed, like what kind of wine they were drinking, what their conversations were. somebody took very, very, very extensive spying notes on that meeting. Unfortunately for Jared, because he didn't get the money, and very unfortunately for the CEO of Ong Bong Insurance, who was subsequently tried and convicted of some nonsense and sentenced to 18 years of hard labor, where he now sits. So, be careful where you have your secret meetings. I happen to also think that, well, okay, let's just go into the pandemic because we're running out of time. The pandemic, 30,000 foot should have removed any doubt that, inside the Chinese system, the party now controls everything, including the scientific collaboration. So, it's not that we don't want to decouple all the way. We don't want to say that we can't have cooperation with China in areas of mutual interest. But if you can't cooperate on a pandemic, what exactly can you cooperate on? If you can't rely on Chinese scientists to have basic transparency and accountability when the world's worst pandemic ever breaks out on the doorstep of the coronavirus lab, you have to admit at that point, if you're an honest person, that we got a problem here with the scientific collaboration. So that's number one. Now, the second part is the part that you mentioned, is that, oh, wait, it forces us to recognize that the Chinese government has neutered all of these international oversight bodies, not just the WHO, but that they've had a 30-year strategy of infiltrating all these organizations and their leadership to corrupt them or neuter them or just, manipulate them to protect the CCP. And oh, well, it's not like we don't when the aviation, or International Aviation Organization takes Taiwan off the map, everyone says boo-hoo, but we all move on with our lives. But when the WHO can't investigate the origin of the largest pandemic in human history, well, then real people suffer under that. Okay. And that's not even getting to the cover up and the fact and the lack of data and the lack of transparency. They still won't share the early data. So it's still having an effect on our understanding of how we got into this mess and how to get out of it and how to prevent the next one. And so that's on the science side. On the broader side, what the pandemic revealed was that how China, as a global power, would use its first mover advantage. The first country to have the pandemic, the first country to test the vaccines, the first country to get out of it, at least the first wave of it. And what we saw is a worldwide campaign of bribing, coercing, blackmailing countries, first with masks, then with ventilators, then with vaccines, shitty vaccines, but still, and not to advance China's mercantilist economic interest, but to advance the CCP's political agenda. When the Chinese government went into, a real example, Paraguay and Nicaragua, and said, hey, we'll give you shots, if life-saving medicine, if you drop diplomatic recognition of Taiwan. They were putting that government to a test. Does it love Taiwan more than the lives of its own citizens? Paraguay didn't take the shots. Nicaragua did take the shots. They dropped Taiwan like a hot potato. Okay, that's a political coup. And that just shows you how a Chinese-led world order would look like. We know what a Russian-led world order looks like now, right? All of a sudden, everyone's like, oh, wait, Russian-led world order is not good. That's a terrible thing. They're going to cluster bomb cities for no reason. Well, this is what the Chinese-led world order looks like. We saw 2 years of it. It's them using whatever power and influence they have to bully any country that can be bullied, or bribe any country that can be bribed, to protect the party, not the country, the party. And of course, that caused the backlash. Of course, this is my third and last point. What we learned about China during the pandemic is that, oh, wait, autocracies aren't geniuses, because look at this backlash. They pissed off people in democracies all over the world. They crushed the Australian economy in the middle of a pandemic. It's a cruel thing to do. Lithuania, you name it. There's a whole list of countries now. Some countries folded. Brazil took the deal and they took the Huawei. The UK went the other way. They were going to take the Huawei and then they didn't, because the people were like, no, we don't like being blackmailed and having Chinese spy equipment in our network. So it could go either way. But the point is that what we see is that the Chinese government can't admit any mistakes anymore. And this is really problematic if you think about it for 1 second, because if their system is so consolidated and nobody can tell Emperor Xi what to do anymore, well, then how can they ever reverse course? And aren't we headed towards some sort of escalation ladder that we can't get off of? That's something to think about. But meanwhile, what it tells us is that actually democracy is still the better system, because at least we can change. It's not perfect, but at least when the information, the circumstances change, we can change our strategy. And look at China. They're at zero COVID on Omicron because they weren't able to realize it's a different variant that requires a different policy. I'm not saying we handle it great, but the point is that there are real problems inside China. And how are they going to open up and not get a billion people with Omicron in a week and a half? And if they don't open up, then how can their economy bounce back? And these are real problems for Xi to think about. So, they're not actually 10 feet tall. And in the end, we still have the high ground and we still have all of the advantages.
I think that's not a bad way to kind of move to Q&A, because it does sort of tie the concept together that that I hope people have gotten from this. Just as much as this is an intimidating issue, it's also something we can address. So they aren't 10 feet tall. Xi Jinping is not 10 feet tall. He's the leader.
He's tall though. I saw him once. He's actually quite tall, but not 10 feet.
Not 10 feet. And these are
got to be like 6'5". I'm telling you, big too, big bone.
Yeah. So with that, Barrett, do you want to take it away? I think it's time for Q&A.
Yeah. So our first question comes from Russ Daggett. Russ, are you there? He asked.
Yes. Let's see. To what extent was the Trans-Pacific Partnership the right approach to building a rules-based economic partnership to counter China's power in the region?
Well, I don't think it would have. Look, we should have passed the TPP. There was an easy compromise, I think, to include currency manipulation, which is what some of the harder core opponents wanted. They wanted something actionable on currency manipulation, which I fully agreed with. So I think we could have done a TPP that would have generally been a good thing, but the Obama administration oversold it as a way to contain China. It would have linked up our economies. That's a good thing. It would have brought a little more consensus to us, but it didn't address the fundamental issue of Chinese predation. But yeah, we should have done TPP with a few little changes, but I still think we'd be in a similar situation today.
Yeah, I largely agree with that. I would just add that, the reason that we didn't do it is because our leaders failed to bring along their constituencies, and the idea that of free trade being to the benefit of Americans in the long run, and both parties lost the thread on that. And so it became politically impossible. So it's kind of weird to talk about something that neither party supports. Even Hillary Clinton, who helped craft it, didn't support it when she ran. So, I would be satisfied with any trade policy, because what the Trump people always says, oh, well, we don't like multilateral trade. We're going to do one by one. Well, how did that work out? And I saw them sort of like try to strong arm the South Koreans and the Japanese. I thought it was really clumsy. And, then they were talking about, oh, we'll do a free trade agreement with Pakistan or UK or Taiwan or something. Very few of those actually amounted to much. So I don't like, we need more engagement in the region. I'm kind of agnostic about the structure of it. I would just rather that, we find the realm of the possible and move forward, because China's moving forward, and the absurdity of them joining TPP, as Orwellian as that rings in my head, is an actual real possibility now, not because we didn't do TPP, but because we didn't do much at all. And we're still not doing much at all.
So we've had a lot of conversations this week about the future of climate change and how to engage with China on climate, given that they are the biggest contributor of CO2 emissions globally. And I'm curious, I think that plays out in several other fields, including, the depletion of fisheries and fish species around the world. I'm curious if you all have thoughts about, one of the things we've been talking about is weighing the benefits of engagement versus based on what we've seen so far, not being able to trust, the Chinese, and by Chinese, I mean Xi Jinping's word. And I'm curious if you all, if Rob and Josh, you have thoughts about a way to thread the needle on that front.
And I have one quick statement to make, which is just that I don't understand why we aren't sinking those fishing fleets. When you bring in, 10,000 fishing ships and just go right at the Galapagos into protected marine areas and just strip everything, I think we should seize and or scuttle those ships as fast as we can. And I think it's kind of egregious that we haven't. And that's it. I'll let you guys go.
So I don't know anything about fishing, but on the climate thing, there is no needle to thread. We should not engage with them. what the Chinese want to do is they want us to come hand in hand with bargain and trade-off. So one of the early meetings that Obama had with Xi Jinping, he basically said, we want you to help us with climate. And at that point, the Chinese knew they had us, because they knew we were not willing, we were going to give up some things our other asked, which are vastly more important. And in return, China would, quote, do something on climate. Number one, if China's going to do something on climate, they'll do it on their own. I don't just think there's no possible reason why we should want to give up any of our core interests for that. The second thing is China. Why doesn't China help? Why doesn't China come to us and say, bribe us? China is much more vulnerable to climate change than we are. They don't have the money to invest in resiliency. They have more people at lower sea levels. So they're the ones who should be asking us, not the other way around. And the last point I'll make is, look, there's only one way to solve climate change. And the sooner we come to grips with this, is the better we'll be, which is the technology has to be better and cheaper than clean, has to be better and cheaper than dirty. And as long as that's not the case, you're never going to get these poor countries, and I would put China in that same category, to switch over to clean. They're not going to do it. So what we ought to be doing is working with our allies to advance clean, renewable, cheap energy. That's when China will solve climate change, and not before. But the idea that John Kerry has, that we should somehow go hat in hand and negotiate, completely disagree with that. I think it's a terrible, terrible idea.
All right.
Right. Just sorry.
Oh.
Very quickly, I just wanted to agree with Rob that it seemed that in the past, the Obama administration was willing to make trades with China, give up things in order for the cooperation on climate change. To its credit, the Biden administration has actually not followed that path. John Kerry, despite his attempts to follow that path, has lost that internal battle, actually. And that's why we haven't made any real progress in Kerry's talks. He's been marginalized because the Biden team is delinking the issues, even though the Chinese government won't agree to that delinkage. What I say is that the way to thread the needle is to engage with China on climate change, but in a negative way. In other words, to sanction and shut down the industries that they are using to fool us into thinking that they're selling us climate change equipment, because the solar panels are built with Uyghur slave labor, and the solar panel factories are fueled by dirty coal. So we're in a situation where we are wholly dependent on polysilicon and silicon panels and all sorts of other things from Xinjiang on the Chinese markets. And we can't develop our own industries because they can't compete with slave labor. And John Kerry's solution is, oh, well, let's just keep buying the slave labor products. And what I say is, no, actually, if we stop buying the slave labor products, then at least our companies that are paying people will have a chance to compete. But we can only do that if we stop buying the slave, give them an incentive to stop using the slaves, and then realize that when they use dirty coal to build solar panels, it's actually harming the environment, not helping the environment. So it doesn't make it, we're just telling ourselves a story about helping climate change and supporting the slave labor at the same time. So I think we need to go hard at the Chinese slave labor industries, including the solar industry. And we can't solve climate change on the backs of Uyghur slaves. I think that would be trading one atrocity for another.
Thanks, Josh. So the next question comes from David Brin. David, do you want to ask your question? He says, I'll just start. And if you want
hi, can you hear me now?
Oh, no, let me ask you a question for you.
All right.
You sound terrible. We hope you get that cleared up with a doctor. Isn't the most dangerous aspect to all this the riling up of the PRC public with paranoid siege fears of US hostility? Can't we answer with the pure fact that we have been, across 3,000 years, China's only real friend?
5 times we came to China's aid.
Yeah, I think we need to understand that, and Rob alluded to this earlier, that our ability to influence events inside China is extremely limited. Okay, and it was hubristic to think that we would be able to convince Chinese people writ large of things that their government has spent their entire lives convincing them the opposite of. And that's not to say that we shouldn't have engagement. I think area like exchanges and cultural engagement and all that stuff is good, with certain safeguards. But the bottom line is that the big reveal is that it was hubristic to think that we could change China. China's development will be determined by the Chinese people one way or the other. And yeah, there's a good story to tell, but the Chinese government is not telling that story. And it's just like Rob said, if you read their documents, if someone shows you who they are, you gotta believe them. Okay. And we have to realize, and I'm the last time I was in China was in 2016. Of course, all Washington Post journalists are now banned from China since 2018, so I can't go back. But my experience, even up to 2016, was that most Chinese people have never lived in an information environment that wasn't highly controlled. And or it's not like it was in 1989, where now we have an entire generation of Chinese professionals who that's the story they believe. Okay. And it's a problem, and it's not something that we can ignore, but we can't base our policy on trying to make friends with the Chinese people. We just can try to protect ourselves, frankly. And that's the mission of the day.
Okay, last question, and then just keep it very quick because we have to wrap up and move to our next session. But comes from Dan Patton, who asked, "What role does the U.S. consumer have in all of this?" I think it's a good one to end on. We essentially vote on these issues with our pocketbooks, he says.
Well, yeah, it would be nice, but look, the reality is, you can't expect U.S. consumers to wage this war. They're going to consumers do what they do. If this is a job for government, and Josh and I may disagree a little bit. I don't know. We haven't had time to go into it, but look, the way to address this problem is, in my opinion, in the product classes where they're competing unfairly, you basically ban them, or you put on 100% tariffs or something like that. That would influence U.S. consumers. I don't think we should just, it'd be nice if consumers know this, but the reality is consumers as a group are not going to be the engine or the weapon that we need to win this war.
However, employees within companies are often a huge factor in changing the policies of the companies. We saw that within Google, Facebook, and Amazon as they were forced to confront climate change in a very different way. And I think there is a real role to play for tech employees within companies that are supporting or investing in Chinese operations to pressure against that in their work.
So
yeah.
Okay, I look, the way to do this would be to include in ESR or whatever, social responsibility, China, and it's not. And right now, if you protect the environment or hire a few more minorities, you get a lot of points. If you invest in China, you don't get any negative points. So that's one. Secondly, what I worry about with employees, and we didn't get a chance to go into this, I think we need American I would love Google to be in China. I would love that to happen, because the more our companies are in China, taking away market share from the Chinese companies, the more money we get, the less money they get. So I really worry about employees having the say, because they're just going to say, pull out of China completely. What we need to do is stop China from getting our technology, but we need to aggressively go after their market. And so I don't want American companies pulling out of the Chinese market. I want them to be going more aggressively at them. That to me is in our long-term interest. So I'm not sure employees would understand that nuance.
Yeah, I think I do disagree with you, Rob. I have more faith in employees and in the American people to stand up for what's right. I saw that during the Olympics. These corporations, for the moment, of course, don't see it as in their financial interest to do the right thing when it comes to corporate social responsibility in China, like Nike not buying the slave labor cotton and sending it to us to put on our feet. Because you're right. As of right now, there's not enough of a public voice, not enough of a public pressure. But I think that's changing, and I think the Olympics was a pretty good example of that, because the corporate sponsors were all shamed. They didn't really change, but at least they were shamed. And I know one employee named Daryl Morey, who was the general manager of the Houston Rockets, and he exercised his right to free speech and by tweeting one tweet, "Stand with Hong Kong," and the NBA was punished by the CCP by the tune of $400 million. The Rockets still aren't on TV 5 years later in China. Even the Sixers aren't on TV because Daryl Morey moved to the Sixers. They banned the Sixers.
Josh, I'm going to have to interrupt you here.
I
can tell you're
finish.
going down a basketball rabbit hole, and I know how much you love that, and we are
Let me make my point. All right, let me make my point. My point is, all all American companies in China are corporate hostages of the CCP, one way or another. The path is only going in one direction. They're going to make some money while they can, but in the end, they're going to have to choose their American consumers over their
Okay.
Chinese consumers in order to avoid being complicit in the genocide.
Got
Thank you
it.
very
Thank you. And with that, we are very out of time. I want to thank Rob and Josh for taking the time to be here with us. Your perspective is extremely helpful and very interesting.